This is a scene of a recent deadly attack in Afghanistan's long-running conflict. Suicide bombers detonated their explosives at a funeral in the eastern city of Jalalabad, killing at least 17 people. It happened on New Year's Eve, capping off a string of attacks in what was an exceptionally violent year. These Afghans are mourning the dead from a different attack just days earlier. A suicide bomber claimed by Daesh blew himself up in a Kabul compound near a Shia cultural center. The bombing killed 40 people. They included women and children. At this hospital, survivors of the attack receive treatment while their relatives wait in shock. Many of these people are part of the country's Shia minority. They say they've been abandoned by their government, left vulnerable to an increasing number of attacks against them over the past year. This distraught woman blames the Afghan president directly. The same compound that housed a Shia cultural center was also home to the Afghan Voice news agency. Its Kabul headquarters have been shuttered by the attack for now. Observers say the incident is the latest sign of a major increase in violence against journalists. In May, Daesh claimed an attack on an Afghan state TV building in Jalalabad that killed 6 people. And in November, at least 1 person was killed when Daesh fighters stormed a private TV station in Kabul. There were at least 71 other documented cases of attacks on journalists in 2017. That's a 35% increase compared with the year before. Critics say the surge in violence against journalists and minorities is a symptom of the country's deteriorating security situation. The question many are now asking is whether the Afghan security forces and the US-led coalition that backs them will be able to turn things around. Afghanistan is grappling with a range of security challenges, from a persistent Taliban threat to unruly warlords and the recent emergence of Daesh. Meanwhile, Afghan forces are struggling to deal with endemic corruption, and troop morale is critically low in the face of record-level casualties. In response, the US and its NATO coalition have each announced more personnel to help train and support the Afghan security forces.
Bureaucrats don't win battles. Soldiers do.
The number of US soldiers in the country is expected to rise to nearly 16,000 this year, up from a low of about 11,000 in 2017, but it's still far off the peak levels seen in 2010. Other NATO members are increasing their personnel numbers by a combined 3,000 in 2018. At the end of one of the worst years on record since the US invaded Afghanistan 16 years ago, many critics are questioning whether this new surge will make any difference, and whether the Afghan people have any realistic hopes for peace in their near future. Basil Rayhan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Kabul is Javad Faisal. He's the deputy spokesman for the chief executive of Afghanistan. In Washington, D.C., we have Omar Samad. He's the former Afghan ambassador to Canada, France, and Belgium. And on set with me here in Istanbul, we have Afghan-American journalist and author Fariba Nawa. Thank you all for joining us. Javad Faisal, let me begin with you. The Taliban's in control of almost half the country, and now we're seeing Daesh attacking with more regularity. It's a horrible situation on the ground. Has your government lost control of the security situation to the Taliban and Daesh?
First of all, Taliban are not in control of half of the country. Last year, in the year 2015, were a tough year, both years, but 2017 was a year where we had progress. The 2 years, 15 and 16, our provincial capital fell to Taliban. Our district centers were threatened. But in 2017, we had no case as such in the entire country. Our Air Force is in a better situation. Taliban can no longer attack major cities or district centers. All they do is to just carry out side attacks and harm local civilians.
Okay, but I deeply suspect that you're missing the tone of this entire discussion here, because we're talking off the back of a massive Daesh attack that has just butchered people along sectarian lines. And I'm saying not just the Taliban, and we can debate this, but between 30 to 45% of the country is in their hands right now. I'm not making this up. This is empirical fact. And again, I ask you, in addition to that, Daesh is blowing up Afghans for being Shia, for being different, or for just being Afghans. And you're telling me the past 2 years have been progress. How has that been progress?
I'm talking about this here, like I said earlier, none of our provincial capitals fell to Taliban this year. None of our district centers have fallen to Taliban in the past couple of months. Daesh is not a problem that belongs to Afghanistan only. It's a problem that belongs to the world. But Daesh is not a big threat, as big a threat as Taliban are to Afghanistan. If there are no Taliban, if we can destroy them with the support of international community, there will be no space for Daesh or others. But like I said earlier, the only thing that terrorists, Taliban and Daesh or other groups, they carry out now are suicide attacks and explosion. They can no longer fight on the ground against Afghan national security forces, which is a progress. Our air force is in a better situation. We have more support from international troops.
Okay. Let me bring in Ambassador Omar Samad. Are you encouraged after hearing that from the deputy spokesman for Chief Executive Abdullah?
Well, I'm neither encouraged nor discouraged. I think the situation on the ground obviously is critical in the sense that the forces, whether you call them Daesh, Khorasan, which is a sort of a local version of IS, with a lot of questionable issues affiliated to it, or the Taliban, first of all, have not been able to make headways. Now, remember, the Americans called this a stalemate last year, and I think that what we are seeing is the thawing of the stalemate to some extent, and the softening of this stalemate over the past year. At the same time, Daesh and Taliban, and sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between the two, have resorted to very extreme measures like targeting attacks, killings, assassinations, and more importantly, suicide attacks on soft targets such as mosques, such as markets, even hospitals. So this obviously is to create a climate of fear and terror on one hand. On the other hand is to make it look fantastic. And they have been able to do so. But on the ground, I don't think that if you look at the balance, the Taliban have made a lot of headway. They have not made headway. I think the Afghan forces have held off the Taliban somewhat more effectively. And I think the American announcements to support the Afghans has helped boost morale to some extent, but there are a lot of other issues at play in Afghanistan, including the political situation and the economic situation that also impact security.
Okay. Fariba Nawa, as someone who left the country, and as you were telling me before the show, you can't go back right now. When you hear about the current security situation, and you hear NATO saying they're sending 3,000 more troops, and they're boosting the Afghan security forces, do you feel that they can sort out your country so that you can go back?
Not necessarily at this point, because what I'm seeing is perception versus reality. Even if there are more troops on the ground, if you don't have local support, if the Taliban are winning more hearts and minds than the government is, we're not going to have security at this point. I don't see that happening. I am somewhat hopeful with this sort of idea that we need to confront Pakistan more, confront the foreign meddling more. But we have infighting inside the government, and I think that's a huge weakness that needs to be tackled and resolved.
Let's talk about Pakistan for a moment, because US President Donald Trump had tweeted about them not long after these recent attacks. He went on Twitter and said the United States has foolishly given Pakistan more than $33 billion in aid over the last 15 years, and they have given us nothing but lies and deceit, thinking of our leaders as fools. They give safe haven to the terrorists we hunt in Afghanistan with little help. No more. Hamid Karzai, former president, agreeing with that, said President Donald Trump's tweet on Pakistan's duplicitous position over the past 15 years is vindication that the war on terror is not in bombing Afghan villages and homes, but in the sanctuaries beyond Afghanistan. I welcome today's clarity in President Trump's remarks and propose a joint U.S. regional coalition to pressurize the Pakistan military establishment to bring peace to not just Afghanistan, but the entire region. Javad Faisal, do you support that? Do you believe that Pakistan is the source of all your problems?
Certainly, we have been saying for so many years that the main problem is within Pakistan. The terrorists you named, Taliban, Daesh, or other organizations, they have all been supported by Pakistan. The Daesh we have in Afghanistan is not a Daesh from Iraq or Syria. It's the one created within Pakistan, labeled by Pakistanis as Daesh, or some of them are former Taliban, who were divided after the death of Mullah Omar. So the main problem is within the Pakistan. We have been asking our international partners, especially America and the NATO, that there is the main problem. We have to work with them, or we have to find ways to encourage them to not support the enemies of Afghanistan, the enemies of the world, because terrorists are enemies to everybody. I will have to say that Taliban are not winning minds in Afghanistan or hearts in Afghanistan. They are the enemies of these people. They have been killing our people on a daily basis. And the support comes to Taliban is from Pakistan or some other countries, but mainly Pakistan. If Pakistan stops supporting Taliban, we will not have any problem against them. Taliban cannot have any safe havens within Afghanistan. They will be destroyed, and the groups that have been supported by Taliban will be destroyed too.
In the interest of time, I'm going to take the response to that and pose it to Ambassador Omar Samad. The counterpoint to that is that we've had the US Defense Secretary Mattis even saying that the Russians and the Iranians are also supporting the Taliban, giving them weapons, and so on. I spoke with the Pakistani Foreign Minister Khawaja Asif, who said, hey, in the past, maybe Pakistan supported some of these groups like the Haqqani Network, but no more. And he believes, and Pakistan believes, that at the moment the United States and Afghanistan are scapegoating Pakistan for their failures for 16 years in Afghanistan. They need an easy punching boy. They need a scapegoat, and that is Pakistan. Is there any truth to that?
I don't think it's an issue of scapegoating Pakistan. I think that the record speaks for itself. The international community knows very well what role Pakistan has played. Unfortunately, the role that Pakistan has played over the last even 20, 25 years, even before 9/11, was a very destructive, unhelpful role, not only unhelpful to Afghanistan, but also to Pakistan itself and the region overall. Now, there's an attempt nowadays, because of the shifting geopolitical scene in South Central Asia and the Middle East, for Pakistan to try to get China, Russia, and Iran on its side. There is no conclusive evidence that there is all-out assistance to the Taliban by these countries, but what we do know is that there are contacts and there are talks that have taken place. Maybe there's more, we don't know yet, but I think that both the Iranians and the Russians are looking at this from a different angle. They're looking at it from an angle of IS being a threat, and they are fearful that Afghanistan might become sort of a breeding ground for IS. So the Taliban may be an enemy, but they're not the immediate enemy as far as they're concerned. So they're talking to the Taliban. So there's a lot of shifting going on in the region. But at the end of the day, what has to happen, and everybody has to agree on, is that terrorism doesn't have good and bad terrorists. Terrorism is bad across the board. You cannot differentiate between this group being better than the other group, because they all aim to terrorize individuals, societies, and destabilize the situation as we have seen it.
Well, but some are, right? Some are. I mean, Hamid Karzai himself, who says the Taliban are sons of our soil, we need to talk to them, whereas Daesh are foreigners and we need to treat them differently. So that is one way of looking at it. And given that the Taliban has so much land in the country, it makes sense, right? When you look at a possible peaceful resolution down the line.
Who you talk. It depends on how you define the Taliban. The Taliban are a conglomerate made up of different interest groups. Some of them are radicalized Islamists. Others are there because they are disgruntled because of something that has happened, or injustice, or maybe bad governance or corruption. Some of them have been hurt for one reason or the other. Others are in the drug business, in illegal activities. And some of them are affiliated with international terrorists. So it depends on which part of the Taliban we're talking about. Those Afghans who are not affiliated with international terrorism, who are not affiliated with international drug mafias, who are not affiliated with radical thinking and radical activities and violence and terrorism, they at any point are welcome to come and join and talk and sit down around the table. And I think that's what most Afghans, including Karzai and others, are saying, including the current government. What we are seeing is that some of these people are prevented from doing so by other forces in the region who have ulterior motives and other agendas at play.
Understood. Fariba Nawa, it's not a great situation right now. If you were in President Ashraf Ghani's shoes or Chief Executive Abdullah's shoes, what would you do differently? I mean, they've got a tough job ahead of them. It's very difficult for them. It's very difficult to prevent these sorts of massacres. But what would you do differently?
Well, the first thing that we need to address is the infighting in the government that I said. And there have been just article after article coming out about this sort of Pashtunization inside the government, alienating minorities, especially Shiites and Hazaras. There are, many Hazaras believe that these attacks against them are engineered inside the government. So that perception is really damaging. And there's a lot of micromanagement on Ashraf Ghani's part. When he was finance minister, that was one of the biggest criticism against him. And he's still doing the same. Pulling governors out of the north, for example, firing them, that may not be the answer right now. And he's not able to hold on to major parts of the country, as you mentioned. So I think we need to look at the bigger picture. And once you look at the bigger picture and are able to talk to locals and are able to win back some of this support that he's lost over the years, then we can talk about a solution. But right now, you're right. The solutions seem to be farther and farther in the distance. And so there are two themes to Afghanistan historically. We have foreign meddling and internal neglect.
Right.
And that hasn't changed.
Yeah. As Ambassador Omar Samad said, there's a lot of shifting, and I think a lot of the shifting is happening with the boots on top of the heads of the Afghan people, unfortunately. It's been a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I thank you all for joining us. Fariba Nawa, Javad Faisal, and Omar Samad. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.